welcome to Flight Test. I'm TJ, and this is the Atom version 3. Now in our store we have two different versions. We have the bind and fly, which you get it, bind it up to your radio, and take off. And then we have the DIY version, which means you have to build it yourself, but it's not a hard build. It's going to take about 20 minutes, 30 minutes if you're just going through it. And there's a really good manual, and I hope this build video will help you as well. So get your things ready, we'll get started. All right, in this section of the build, we're going to be getting our power cube set up, and that includes installing our battery connector, VTX antenna, getting the base of it ready to go, installing it to the frame, and then actually tinning all of our ESC pads. All right, now that we're ready to start our build, the reason it's going to be so fast and easy is just based off of this cube alone. The bottom of it is an OSD VTX, and that's where our battery goes into. The next two stacks are 2-in-1 ESCs. Your motor pads are on both sides of it. And then the very top is our flight controller. So everything is all nice and neat packaged in this little cube. And so all we'll have to do is get our motor soldered to it and go from there. But to start everything off, we'll flip it upside down to where you see your battery pads on the very bottom. You take your battery lead. Depending on which one you have, you might have a red wire or a white wire. The red or white will be your positive, and the negative is going to be the black. So we use a little bit of flux, get our battery pads ready to go, get them tinned. Just do a little bit of tin on our wires here. And we'll get them ready to go. Positive to positive, and negative to negative. Now if you haven't soldered before, I definitely suggest you take a little bit of time and practice before you do anything on something that you don't want to break. And we'll have links in the description for soldering videos if you need to study up. And that's it for that. So our battery connector is on. Next thing we can do is choose which antenna we want. So in this kit, you have two different selections. You have one which is just a little whip antenna, and this is great if you're trying to save weight or you don't really want to go too far, you know, pretty close. So it's very durable, very hard to break, but you're not going to get as much penetration or as range as you would something like a circular polarized. So for us, instead of using our whip antenna, we have another attachment here that's going to allow us to use the TBS Triumph that comes in your kit. So with this, we'll run it right along with the battery cable, put it over this connector, and it will just snap on. There we go. I felt it click, and just run it right beside of it, and we can leave that there. Alright, now that we have our battery leads on and our VTX antenna in, when we put the VTX antenna on, it did snap in place. However, crashes and just regular flying, it may work itself out. Now the next piece we have is our plastic base plate for the cube. And if you look, there's a little plus that's kind of off of it, a little additional plastic piece here. When positioned right, this plastic piece will hold that antenna in. So we'll take that plus, line it up right above the VTX antenna, and that way when we screw this in, it's going to hold it there. Now on the base, you have two recessed holes on the opposite sides of two flat. The recessed holes is what we're going to screw our short screws with the flat heads. This is going to be to hold this plastic piece onto our cube. And we don't want to go too tight with it as to break the plastic or bend it, but just enough to hold it in place. Alright, now that we have our screws in place, the next thing is they include the 3M double-sided tape. This is going to allow us to use tape to help hold the cube into the frame. It'll also be screwed, but never hard. It doesn't hurt to have more than we need. With the tape, you have two corners cut out. This is going to be to leave the holes open to screw this into the frame shortly. So just line it up, stick it on, and that's good for now. Now that we have our double-sided tape on the bottom of the cube, we can install it into the frame. So we'll bring our frame over. On the bottom it's completely flat. On the inside of the frame, you can see how it's kind of cut out. This is where our cube is going to sit. So it matches in perfectly. You have your battery and your antenna coming out the back. So what we'll go ahead and do is take the paper off of our tape. Get it lined up. Now it sets perfectly inside of the carbon. Just kind of push it down to get it secured. And then on the bottom, you can see 2 holes are covered up by the tape, and then 2 holes are open. Now they include these white plastic nylon screws, and this is what they have you to additionally secure the power cube onto the frame with. So get those started. So to screw these in place, now they are nylon screws, so you don't want to go too tight with them because it will strip the threads out. But just enough to hold them in place. Now on my other builds that we have here, instead of using the nylon, because they did, after a few crashes, I ended up breaking those out. But on our other builds, what I did is I had just normal steel screws, and I used those to hold the power cube in place, and so far it seems to be working out just fine. Now that we've put our cube on our frame and it's secured in place, the second and third plates are ESCs, 2 and 1. So on this side you have 3 motor pads on the top, 3 motor pads on the second one, and the same thing on the back. 3 motor pads, 3 motor pads. So what we need to do is get those tinned and ready to go. If you don't feel comfortable soldering within these tiny spaces, you can remove these 2 nuts, pull the Flite controller off, and then you'll see there's 4 brass collar nuts on all the corners. You pull those off and pull the next plate off, and that'll give you more room to work. Now, however, in the actual manual, they suggest just doing it this way, and that's what we're going to do. There's enough room for us to really do it without having much trouble. Before we put any solder on it, we'll go ahead and do a little bit of flux, just right along those motor pads on both sides. And all that's going to do is just allow the solder to flow in a little bit easier. And we'll turn it around and do the same thing on the back. So now that we have our power cube on our frame, all of our ESC pads tinned and ready to go, this is pretty much done for now. So the next part of the build, we're going to move on to changing out motor wires. Now this is one part that I wish that they did from the factory before they sent it to us. So out of everything that I've done with this so far, flying, building, this is my only complaint that I have yet. So on these, the way this has, you have 2 motors with black nuts on the top and 2 motors with silver nuts, and these determine which direction the motor spins and which direction your nuts spin on the actual threads. Now with that said, you can see that I've already selected some wires and I haven't pulled up. The motors with the silver nuts, your middle wire, what they call motor wire 2, what we have to do is we have to extend that wire. Now in these kits, they do give us the additional wire, but instead of already having them on the motors, what we're going to have to do is they want us to remove this heat shrink, pull this middle wire off, and solder this in its place at the heat shrink. So it's going to give us just a little bit more room to reach the furthest pad on the board. And then the motors with the black nuts, motor wire 1 is the one we're going to have to extend. So in this part, what we're going to do is we're just going to go through, remove those wires, solder in the extensions, reheat shrink them, and then they'll be ready to install on our frame. So instead of removing the heat shrink and desoldering and redoing it there, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up just a little bit off the heat shrink, and we're just going to cut that middle wire. So we have the silver nut. Wire number 2 is the one they want us to remove. Yeah, so after we cut it, we're coming up just a little bit off the heat shrink, and we're just going to strip it down to the heat shrink, and all that's going to do is allow us to have just a little bit of wire to attach our extension onto. I'm going to line them up side by side, just solder them together, and then we'll heat shrink them and it'll be ready to go. To help us out here, we're going to use our helping hands just because these are a little hard to try to hold everything together at the same time. So I'm just going to turn it around here for the camera. These wires are pretty stiff, so it'll come up by itself. And all I'm going to do is just line them up as close as I can get them. And I'm not helping Christian out right now. And there we go. So we'll just line them up and just hit them with a little dab of solder. And that'll hold them. So once we have that there, I've already pre-cut some heat shrink. So we'll just run it back down over. Put that in place. Get our heat gun. It's a little bit long on the heat shrink, but it'll work. So you can see it gives us a little bit more room on that middle wire, and pretty much all that's going to do is on our frame when we put that in, the far pad that wire is going to go to, it gives us a little bit more room to get to it. So we'll go ahead and get the other 3 motors ready to go. And just like we did on the motors with the silver nuts, on the black nuts, motor wire 1, it's going to be the one that gets extended, and we're just going to repeat the process. And there we go. A bit of heat shrink. Now that we have all 4 motors with the extended wires on them, we're ready to move on to the next part of the build. And all that's going to be is taking the motors, soldering them to their intended spots, and then installing them to the actual frame. It's a little bit easier to solder them on the cube before you install them to the frame, so that's what we're going to do first. So now we'll turn the frame with the back of it to us. Motor number 1 is going to be the back right. Motor number 2 is going to be the front right. Motor number 3 is back left. And motor number 4 is front left. So motor number 1 will be the top pads, and motor number 3 is going to be the bottom. And since it's going to be easier to work from the bottom to the top, we'll start with motor number 3. And it'll be a black nut. It's going to be number 3. And then motor wire 1 is the one with the extension. It's going to be going to the furthest pad. And the other 2 will be just in line. So furthest pad, middle wire will be going to the middle pad, and the far left wire is going to be to the far left pad. Before you install your motor, just pre-tin the wires. Now they come with a little bit already on them from the factory. This way we have our own solder on. So we'll take the longest wire and lay it on the farthest pad. And before we do that, I'll just take my cutters to give us a little bit of angle to help with getting into the slot there. So furthest wire, furthest pad on the bottom. So a little bit of heat, push it in, and good to go. So for the second one, the middle pad will be the middle wire here. Just line it up, put a little heat on it, and good to go. And the closest pad will be the closest wire. Same thing, line it up, put a little bit of heat, and let it cool. So we have all three motor wires on, and the way it'll work is when we go to install it, the wires just kind of lay down the side and we can screw the motor in. But before we do that, move on to motor number 1. It'll be a silver nut on the motor. Motor wire 2, the one we extended, will be going to the furthest pad. The far left wire will be going to the middle. Far right wire will be coming to the right. So we'll start off with motor wire 2 to the furthest pad. And same thing as before. Just line it up, lay it on, apply a little heat. So after we have motor wire 2 in, the far left wire, we'll put it on the middle pad on the top. Line it up, a little heat. And so now it'll be the far right motor wire on the far right pad. Line it up, a little bit of heat, and let it sit. So now while we're at this part, we'll go ahead and get these two motors installed on the actual frame. That comes with these kits and the motors, and each of these little packs has different lengths of screws. And you also have a spare prop nut, which I suggest putting those somewhere safe to keep. And so now on your screws, you have some longer ones and shorter ones. We want 4 of the longer screws. This frame is thicker and they require the long screws for that. And these 4 shorter ones, we'll just save those for another project. So now that we have our screws, there we go. So now if you want to use Loctite, now would be the time. Use the blue Loctite. So if you have a problem, you can remove the screws at a later date. For myself, I tend to just put them in and tighten them down, and I haven't had issues yet. So just snug them up to where they're not tight, and we can still move the motor around to help line the other nuts up. So now we'll tighten them down. Tighten one, go to the opposite side, tighten the other. Same thing. Get the last 2, and there's one motor secure. So now we'll get the other motor, same thing. We'll open up the package for it. That's funny. I'll try to kill myself with a knife. Now when you do install these motors, you can install them any direction you want. But for our purposes, we want the motor wires to be along the arm. So we'll just make sure that the motor wires are along the arm when we put in our first screw. And that way, when the motor gets screwed down, these wires are lined here, and we can either use a piece of black tape or just a small zip tie to hold them in place. Tighten one up, go to the other side. And we have the back 2 motors on. So now with the front facing you, the motor arm to your right on the bottom is motor 4, and this will be motor 2. So motor 4, just opposite, will be a silver nut, and just like we did earlier, motor wire 2 that we extended will be going to the furthest pad, and motor 4 goes onto the bottom pads. So we'll install this first just like we did earlier. Motor wire 2 to the furthest pad, and let's prop it back up. Line it up. And let it cool. Then we need the far left wire will be going to the middle pad. And the far right wire to the far right pad. Now we have motor 4 in. Take motor 2 and the same thing as earlier again. the long extension wire will be going to the far right pad. We'll start there, and the other two will just line right up where they go. Line it up. And the second one. Now that we have both motors soldered in, just like earlier, we'll get our screws out and we'll install the motors to the frame. Now that we have our motors installed to the frame, the thing I want to do is take the motor wires, line them up on the arms where they're out of the way, and we'll just take a piece of black tape, or if you just have zip ties, whatever you want, just to help secure those motor wires to the frame. We'll just cut it a small piece. Doesn't have to be anything too long. We'll start it on the bottom and just wrap around the wires. And that'll just help it, instead of in a crash, whenever a prop begins to bend or whatever, keeps the motor wires from having to flop up into the props. And one more to go. Alright, now that we have our motors installed, soldered to the ESCs, and motor wires secured to the frame, in the next part of the build, what we're going to do is take our receiver, and in this build we chose a Spectrum to serial receiver with auto bind, and we're going to install it to the frame. In this build, depending on which kind of receiver you use, you can either use the port here to plug it in, or the 3 pins or 3 holes here. You have signal, power, and ground to install your receiver. For us, we're using the Spectrum serial receiver with auto bind, and on this one, the connector is not the right connector for the board. So we're just going to shorten up the wire and install it to the 3 holes for the receiver. Just plug it in. We'll line up our receiver about where we think we're going to install it. So for us, we'll just use a bit of double-sided tape and stick it to the top of the Flite controller. And so that means these wires will be wrapping around, and that's about where I want to cut them. So I'm just going to cut these down, save that for another project. And stripper wires. Power. There we go. Stripped a little too much on the signal wires, so we'll just cut it down just a little bit. Tenor wires. And now the 10, I'm just going to shorten them up a bit for the ones that we've gotten a little too long. Don't need too much. Okay, now that we have our wires 10 and ready to go, just line them into the slots here. So on our receiver, gray is signal. So we'll just put it in. And you can do it one of 2 ways. You can remove the Flite controller and solder it that way. But for this instance, it's going to be just as easy to solder it from the top here. So our signal's in place. Next thing we'll do will be our power. Just line it up here. And last but not least will be our ground. So now that we have our receiver wire in place, I'm just going to take a bit of double-sided tape And all this is going to be used for is just to hold our receiver on top of our Flite controller. Now when selecting a receiver, you can use pretty much anything you want. The only stipulation is going to be the canopy. So our canopy will install over top of our cube, and we just want enough room for our receiver to be able to sit on top of the cube with the canopy in place. So for us, we'll test it out real quick just by lining it up. And let's move our wire out of the way here. Just plug it in. And my plan is to have our receiver situated just like this. So we can just take our receiver antennas, push them down through the back holes, and slide our canopy right over top of it before we do anything permanent. And if you look right there, it's looking like it's not going to go all the way down with that receiver. So what we can do on our receiver here, it has 2 screws in the front. We'll just remove those screws, pull the plastic off, and then just stick it down without the plastic casing on it. Alright, now that we have our receiver decased, now we can go ahead and plug it in. And for me, just to help hold these antennas on the receiver, I'm going to place it on the double-sided tape, antennas down. And we'll remove our backing on our tape. Going to stick our receiver on our double-sided tape. Alright, in this step we're going to be installing our FPV camera, which is plug and play thanks to this connector. And depending on how you want to fly, you have 3 different options for camera tilt. Alright, for our camera, the way it's going to work is the wires come off the bottom, and on the front of your power cube, let's get our tweezers here, we'll move the wires out of the way. But if you look, there's 2 connectors, and the bottom left connector is where our camera plugs in. So take our camera cable, and we'll just use our tweezers to give us a hand here. Line it up with the left connector and just slide it in. So our camera is in place now. Now, depending on your style of flying, you have 3 different options for camera tilt. I believe it's a 10-degree tilt, a 30-degree, and a 45-degree. Now we have 2 of them already set up with the 30-degree tilt. So for this one, I want to use the 45, and we can see how fast this thing really gets going. Now the only thing about these camera mounts is when you're using them, if you're flying and you crash, all it is a friction fit. So the camera slides down and it pops into place, which is fine. However, if you have a hard crash, this will pop back out. So if you don't plan on changing the camera mount out anytime soon, I suggest putting a drop of CA glue on both sides, or even just hot glue to help to hold it into place. But if you plan on switching it out, friction fits just fine. Just be sure to take a 2mm screwdriver with you to the field, because if it does pop out, you're going to have to remove your canopy to get it to go back in. So now that we have our camera in the camera mount, we want to use the 2 long screws that come in our kit to secure it into place. And all we're going to do is flip it over. We'll take one of the screws through the front holes on the frame, get it started in the camera mount. Take the second one, do the same. Take our 2mm screwdriver and just snug them up. Now these are metal screws going into a plastic molded camera mount. So be sure not to over tighten, or else you'll strip out your mount. And it's not the end of the world. You can glue it into place, but it's always better just to do it the right way. Our camera mount is installed to the frame. We can move on to the next step. All right, in this part of the build, we're going to be installing the LED strip to the bottom of the frame. First thing you want to do is the inside screws here. You want to remove those off your motors. That's what's going to be to hold your LED strip on. And just take your wire, and you have the two big holes, just run them up through one of the holes. And once it's ran, with the back facing you, you have three connections here. The top left is where our LEDs will be installed at. Connector will only go in one way. Be sure you don't force it in the other. You can break the pins and not be able to use it anymore. We'll flip it back over, and to install them, it's just as simple as adding the two screws to hold it in place. One other thing that I did was put a double-sided piece of tape on top of our receiver, and all that's going to be for is just to stick our wires down from our LEDs to hold them out of the way as we put the canopy back on. Alright, so now that we have our LED strip installed to our frame, the next step is going to be just adding in the battery elements. So we have our battery straps and our battery pads. Now the included battery strap that comes with the Atom is just a little short for the batteries we run. We use a 4-cell 850 milliamp hour. So instead of using this one, I'm going to use one of the Flite test branded, and just to make it usable, you can either leave this on or take it off. We don't need it, so I always just tend to use some wire snips and just get rid of it. Hold on to it, because if you don't, the plastic will shoot across the room. And to install our battery strap, just take it apart with the smooth side towards the cube. Just slide it through one of the slots, pull it all the way down until the loop gets to the frame. Come around the other side and do the same thing. Just push it up through, and then we can just secure it on itself while we do the rest of the build. Then also on the bottom we have our battery pads, and the way they work is just on both sides. You just want one on this side and one on this side, and all that's doing is just giving our batteries something to rest against instead of just the carbon fiber frame. It's right beside that screw. Doesn't have to be perfect, as long as they're there. So the first thing I want to do before we start with the Betaflight and binding, just to secure the back of our board to the actual cube, we have these two little standoffs, and we'll just put them on the screws on the back, finger tight. And what I like to do is I'll take my pliers and put a little bit of force on them. Not enough to strip the screws, but enough to know that they are secured. Just be careful if you do this part. You don't want to over tighten. So once we have our standoffs installed, the next part is going to be connecting it to the computer and testing motor direction. Before we do that, we want to take our FPV antenna and just screw it in to the pigtail. Nowadays, VTXs are pretty good about not overheating and burning up if you don't have an antenna, but we don't want to take that risk. So take our USB cable, plug it into the top USB port on our flight controller. It'll connect on Betaflight, your battery in. Now with no props on, we'll go down to the motors tab, click that we understand the risks and propellers are removed. Scroll up just enough until our motor starts spinning. It's about, say, 1040, and then we want to check the motor direction. Now you can either do it by looking at them, feeling the motors, or just take a piece of tape on your motor shaft and you can feel it spinning. But however, this one is clockwise, which it should be. Counterclockwise, clockwise, and counterclockwise. So our motors are correct, which makes life easy. So now that we have confirmed our motors are spinning the correct direction, the next step we're going to do is get our radio bound and get it set up within Betaflight as well. Alright, now that our radio is bound, we unplug the quad. Radio is still turned on. We'll plug it into Betaflight, get it to connect, go ahead and plug in our battery, have no props on, still have our VTX antenna attached, go to a receiver tab, and we're going to check all of our endpoints and center points. So just looking at throttle, it goes from 999 to 2001, which is correct. We want it as close to 1000 to 2000 as we can. So on our spectrum, since it is pretty close, I've had this one previously set up for another model. Each one of our throws are set at 147. 147 pretty much is 1000 to 2000 on every axis. So if your midpoints are not around 1500 or your endpoints are not 1000 to 2000, now's the time to change that depending on which kind of radio you have. And there's a couple, it looks like our pitch is just a few points off. So I'm going to adjust it down to get it a little bit closer to 1500. And there we go, close enough. So now at this point, what we want to do is set our mode switch and our arm switch. So if you look here, we'll toggle our switch A, which is auxiliary 1, and mode switch here, switch D is auxiliary 2. Go to our modes tab, and you can see auxiliary 1 low is our arm, which is correct, and auxiliary 2 low is angle, horizon is in the middle, and fully up would be our rate mode, which is also correct. So you can adjust these however you wish, but for us this is going to work just fine. So now that our radio is set up, our motors are correct, we are done with the computer at this point. We can disconnect everything and get ready to install our canopy. Now that we have that done, the next thing I want to do is install our antennas. Now the frame in the LED strip is designed to have the antennas wrapped through the holes and places along the bottom. Now however, when we've been testing this, we get a lot of fail-safes doing it that route. So I'm going to try a little bit different route, and what I want to do is on our canopy, just right here on the top, these two holes will be for the screws to hold the canopy in place. So right beside those, I'm going to drill just a little hole to allow our antennas to come through, and then we'll use a couple pieces of heat shrink just to ensure that they're not going to flop around too much. So I got a drill bit, and if you need somebody to help you do this part, or even if you want to do it a different way, if you don't feel comfortable doing it this way, you can do it the original way that it's designed for. Just be aware that you may experience fail-safes when doing it that way, and you can always find other ways to better suit you. This is what we're going to try. I don't know if it works. And now we'll just feed the ends through those holes we just made. Maybe. There we go. And they're being really loud. And I don't want to put too much antenna out of our canopy. Pretty much just enough to get it to give us some room here. So what we'll do is we'll put a little piece of heat shrink on them, maybe double layer the heat shrink, and then just a dab of hot glue to hold the antennas in place to keep them from coming out or going back in. Go ahead and get our canopy installed. And once our canopy is installed, then we'll come back and finish getting our antennas finalized. So again, our canopy installed. It's the two screws on the top. and get our pigtail lined up, and be 2 screws to hold it in place. And get that one started, and get the second one started. Alright, so now we have our canopy in place and securely fastened. Now we'll just take some heat shrink, and we'll use some smaller stuff first. And let's see. Yeah, we can take a little bit off of it. And another side.
See how it is, Jordan. Gotta get away from us.
Put some heat to it. And before we get them bent to where we want them, go ahead and put another layer on the outside. Just kind of get them bent to where they're pretty much facing up. Now that our heat shrink is cool, we'll go ahead and add a dab of hot glue to the bottom of the antennas just to help hold them in place. Now, it's not the prettiest way to get your antennas, but they will be off the carbon fiber. Should give us a lot more range and better signal quality as we are flying. We'll get our VTX antenna installed. Alright, now that we have our canopy installed, the next step is just to put our props on, and then we'll be ready to go outside and do a maiden flight. So on our back right motor, it's a opposite thread, so it spins off going to the right. We'll open up our 30 by 40 props. Now with the back of the quad towards you, the back right motor is going to go clockwise. If you look on the edge of your prop, it has a little writing here. That's going to spin into the wind. That's going to be clockwise. So the high side goes into the wind. So we'll put that on. Do one prop at a time, get it tightened up before you move on to the next one. Remember, with this screw, it's the left, tightens it down. Get our prop wrench. And move on to the next one. The black nut moves to the left to loosen up, and this is the opposite prop, so we want to make it counterclockwise, so the high side moves into the wind counterclockwise. Get that one secured, and we'll finish up and get the rest of the props on. Clockwise on this one. And finally counterclockwise on the last. And with our props installed, we can go outside and do a maiden flight.
All right, now that we're outside, we're ready to start the Maiden. Now when you plug this in for the first time, you put your goggles on or looking at your screen or whatever, it's going to want to run through a series of calibration. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. So on our screen, it says center your sticks. So right stick is already centered. We'll bring up our throttle. It's counting down 3, 2, 1. Now it's saying to move our throttle all the way up and hold it there. So our throttle's all the way up. It says okay, move our throttle all the way down and hold it. We are good. Move the roll all the way to the right. We are good. Roll all the way to the left. And good. Now it says move pitch all the way up and hold it. All the way down and hold it. And yaw full right and hold it. And full left and hold it. All right, now it says move the mode all the way up. So our mode switch is D. Go all the way up. And move it to the middle. And move it down. And it says calibration is now complete. All right, now that we've done our calibrations, we kind of went through the menus a little bit. If you want to do more of the menu system or learn more about it, there'll be a link in the description that'll give you all that information. But now what we're going to do is a line of sight test. We never want to start off FPV, but we'll start off line of sight, just nice, easy flight, just to make sure nothing's going to go crazy on us. And if you can tell, it's a little bit windy today. A little windy and it's trying to rain, but we're going to get this done. So that angle is just from the wind pushing. But as far as line of sight, right now, it's not bad at all. All right, that's the Atom version 3. Now it is on the store now in the DIY kit version like we just built, or also in a binding fly, whichever one you want. They're both there. Links will be in the description. Now if you have an Atom version 3 or even a 2 or maybe even a 1, leave a comment below and let us know what you like about it or what you don't like about it. There may be something out there that we don't know about or we didn't do in this video that will help somebody down the road. And with that said, don't forget to subscribe and click the little bell to make sure you get any notifications or anything we do on our channel. Thanks for watching.